Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. Close your eyes, dear traveler, and take a slow, deep breath. Let the weight of the day melt away as you surrender to the quiet pull of slumber. Imagine a world beneath the surface, where time drifts like mist through ancient halls, and forgotten places whisper their stories to the still air. Tonight, we descend into the deep places of Middle-earth, where shadows dance on stone walls and the echoes of lost voices linger in the dark. The great kingdom of Khazad-dûm, once the pride of the dwarves, lies silent now, its vast chambers empty, but for the size of the mountain. Its halls, once filled with the songs of hammer and chisel, now slumber beneath layers of time. And yet, not all that dwells in the dark is at rest. There is something older here, something that has waited, hidden, patient as the slow pulse of the earth itself. A presence of shadow and flame, bound to the deep places, forgotten, but never truly gone. The cool air of the mountains surrounds you as you step toward the entrance of Khazad-dûm. Towering stone gates, carved with runes of old, stand open like the mouth of a sleeping giant. The world outside is hushed, as if holding its breath. A gentle wind stirs, carrying the scent of damp stone and unseen depths. You step forward past the threshold into a kingdom of darkness and memory. Beneath your feet, the floor is smooth and ancient, worn by the countless footsteps of those who came before. Your breath is steady, each exhale a whisper against the silence. The walls rise high, arching above you like the ribs of a long-dead beast. Lantern light flickers, casting shifting shadows that seem to move of their own accord. But there is no fear here, only the quiet presence of something vast and waiting. Deep within the mountain, beyond where light dares to reach, lies a chasm untouched by time. It is here, in the forgotten abyss, that a great power slumbers, a power from an age when gods and monsters walked the earth. Long before the reign of men, before the elves sang beneath the stars, before even the dwarves carved their first halls, this being existed. A creature of fire and shadow, born in a time of war and ruin, now buried beneath stone and silence. It has no name, save for the one history has given it: Durin's Bane. Breathe deeply, dear traveler, and let the weight of ages settle upon you. The story of this creature is one of ancient battles, of kingdoms risen and fallen, of a terror so great that even the bravest dared not speak its name. Tonight, we walk the path of those who came before, tracing the footsteps of history through the darkened halls of Khazad-dûm. Let the echoes guide you, let the shadows embrace you, and drift ever deeper into the world beneath the world. Sleep now, and listen to the whispers of the stone. The journey has only just begun. The halls of Khazad-dûm stretch endlessly before you, an ancient labyrinth of towering pillars and cavernous spaces carved into the very bones of the mountain. Each step forward carries you deeper into history, into the echoes of a world long past. The air is thick with the scent of old stone and lingering memories, as if the walls themselves still hum with the distant reverberations of dwarven voices, voices that have long since faded into dust. Beneath your feet, the path is smooth, worn by centuries of passage. The dwarves who once walked these halls were a proud and industrious people, their hands skilled in the craft of shaping earth and metal. Here, beneath the towering arches, they built a kingdom unlike any other, a place of wonder and wealth, where gold gleamed in torchlight and mithril, the rarest of metals, was pulled from the depths like strands of moonlight woven into stone. But wealth, as it often does, became both a blessing and a curse. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, following veins of silver-bright mithril into the roots of the world. With each stroke of the pickaxe, they peeled back layers of time, disturbing things that should have remained buried. And then, one day, the world beneath their feet shifted. A tremor deep and unseen rippled through the foundations of the mountain. It was subtle at first, a mere whisper in the stone, unnoticed by those who dwelled in the dark. But in the depths, in the places where even dwarves feared to tread, something stirred. A presence, ancient and patient, roused from an age-long slumber. Durin VI was king in those days, a ruler of great wisdom and strength. He led his people with a steady hand, never doubting the might of his kingdom. But the darkness that awakened beneath Khazad-dûm cared nothing for kings or their halls. It had waited in silence for far too long. The first sign of doom came not as a roar, nor as a flame, but as a shadow. A darkness moved where none should be, shifting against the torchlight, swallowing it whole. The dwarves spoke of strange things in hushed tones of air that grew thick and suffocating, of whispers that did not belong to the living. But these were only murmurs, rumors carried on the uneasy breath of the minds. The true horror came later. No one saw it at first. No one knew what had been disturbed. But then, from the depths of the deepest minds, something rose. Fire, not the warm, golden light of the forge, nor the steady glow of a hearth, but a fire that lived, a fire that breathed. It came with a wind of scorching heat, a gust that carried the scent of death and ruin. And in its heart, a shape, tall and terrible, wreathed in flame and shadow. Durin's Bane had awakened, a creature of the First Age, a relic of the wars that had shaped Middle-earth itself. A Balrog, one of Morgoth's most fearsome servants, long thought lost to time. It had slept beneath the mountain for millennia, hidden in the deepest caverns, waiting for the moment when the world above would grow careless enough to set it free. And now, at last, it had been roused. The attack came with no warning, no mercy. Fire rolled through the tunnels like a living thing, igniting the very air, turning steel to liquid in an instant. The dwarves, mighty warriors though they were, could do nothing against a foe like this. Their axes, their great stone walls, the very mountain itself, none of it could hold back the tide of flame and destruction. Durin VI, the proud king of Khazad-dûm, was among the first to fall. The creature claimed him in its wrath, cutting him down with a blade of fire, its whip lashing through the air like a serpent of molten fury. In that moment, an age ended. The dwarves fought bravely, but they were powerless against such a force. Their halls, their temples, their great bridges, and endless staircases, all were swallowed by the flames of the Balrog. His son, Nane-I, led a desperate defense, rallying what survivors he could. But the battle was already lost. The kingdom of Khazad-dûm, once the greatest of all dwarven strongholds, was no more. Those who survived fled, abandoning their ancestral home, their treasures, their legacy. They left behind the halls that had once echoed with the sounds of hammers and laughter. Now, only silence remained, broken only by the occasional whisper of falling stone and the distant, lingering heat of Durin's Bane. For centuries, the Balrog ruled the empty halls. It did not seek conquest, nor did it desire gold or power. It simply was a remnant of an older, darker time, waiting in the shadows, keeping its silent vigil over the ruins of a kingdom that had fallen to its wrath. But the world above did not forget Khazad-dûm. For generations, the dwarves spoke of their lost home with reverence and sorrow, whispering of the terror that dwelled within. They called it Moria, the Black Pit, a name spoken with both fear and longing. Many sought to reclaim it. None succeeded, and so the halls remained in darkness, abandoned but never truly empty, until one day, footsteps echoed once more through the silent city, not the hurried steps of fleeing dwarves, nor the heavy march of invading orcs, but the quiet, careful tread of travelers on a journey far greater than any that had come before. A wizard clad in gray, an elf keen-eyed and wary, a dwarf filled with both pride and sorrow, men of noble heart and unwavering resolve, and 4 small figures carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. They did not come seeking riches, nor did they march to reclaim a lost kingdom. Their path was set for a greater purpose, though they did not yet know the horror that awaited them in the depths. Durin's Bane still lingered, and soon fire and shadow would rise once more. Darkness wrapped around the fellowship like a heavy shroud as they stepped deeper into the ancient ruins of Khazad-dûm. Their torchlight barely cut through the thick air, casting flickering shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls. The vast emptiness of the dwarven halls loomed over them, their once great pillars standing like silent sentinels in the abyss. The weight of history pressed upon them, each step echoing through the long-abandoned city like a ghostly whisper. Gimli walked with his head high, though his heart ached at the sight of his forefathers' fallen glory. Moria, he muttered under his breath. It was not always thus. His fingers brushed the stone walls, as if trying to feel the warmth of his people's past. But all he found was cold silence, a Ahead of them, Gandalf led the way, his staff glowing faintly in the gloom. The wizard's keen eyes scanned the darkness, his mind sifting through memories of tales long told and warnings long forgotten. He knew the history of this place, of the fall of Durin's line, of the terror that had driven the dwarves from their mighty halls. He knew what lurked beyond the veil of shadows, but there was no turning back now. The company pressed on, their path winding through great corridors and endless staircases. The silence was unnerving, so absolute that even the softest breath felt like a disruption. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of being watched became, though no eyes could be seen. It was not long before they came across the first sign of what had claimed these halls. A broken helmet, rusted with age. A skeleton crumpled against the stone floor, its bones scattered as if some great force had hurled it aside. Boromir bent down, his fingers brushing the brittle remains. This was no ordinary battle, he murmured. Whatever struck them down did so with such power that they never stood a chance. Legola's sharp gaze darted around the cavernous hall. "I do not like this place," he whispered. "Something stirs in the dark, something old." Gandalf's expression darkened, though he said nothing. The wizard's grip tightened on his staff as they continued forward, the oppressive stillness growing heavier with each step. Then they found the tomb, a great stone slab, engraved with runes that even the dust of centuries could not hide. The light of Gandalf's staff revealed the words etched deep into the rock, their meaning clear and sorrowful. "Here lies Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria. He is dead." Gimli let out a choked breath, grief filling his eyes. "Balin," he whispered. "So he came here and perished." His voice wavered, but he did not look away. "He was my father's cousin. He dreamed of reclaiming Moria." Aragorn placed a hand on the dwarf's shoulder. "And yet the dream died with him," he said gently. "We must not linger." But even as he spoke, a sound broke the silence. A distant rumbling, low and deep, like a breath drawn from the abyss. The fellowship turned, their hands reaching instinctively for their weapons. The sound was not that of crumbling stone nor shifting earth. It was something else, something alive. And then came the drums, a slow, rhythmic pounding, rolling through the halls like thunder beneath the mountain. Doom, doom. The walls trembled with the force of it. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen menace. The very mountain seemed to exhale, as if something vast and terrible was awakening from a dreamless slumber. "Orcs," Legolas breathed, his hand tightening around his bow. "No," Gandalf whispered, his face pale beneath the glow of his staff. "Something worse." The company barely had a moment to react before the attack began. From the shadows, they came hunched figures with gleaming eyes, their armor rusted, but their blades sharp. Goblins and orcs, drawn to the intruders, their shrieks breaking the silence like shattering glass. The fellowship fought as the dark tide swarmed toward them. Swords flashed, arrows found their marks, and axes struck true. The air filled with the clamor of battle, the sound of steel against steel, of cries and snarls, and the wet thud of bodies falling to the stone. Boromir and Aragorn stood at the front, cutting down orcs with each swing of their blades. Gimli roared with fury, his axe finding purchase in the skulls of his foes. Legolas moved like a shadow, his arrows loosed in rapid succession, each one finding its mark. Frodo and the other hobbits clung to the edges of the battle, their small forms pressed against the cold stone, hearts pounding in their chests. Sam gripped his sword tightly, determined to fight if he must. Then the great doors burst open. A monstrous troll, its skin thick and gray like the mountain itself, lumbered forward, its eyes dull but filled with violence. It roared, the sound shaking the very foundations of the hall. The battle turned desperate. Aragorn and Boromir lunged at the beast, their swords barely piercing its thick hide. The troll swung a massive club, shattering stone and sending echoes of destruction through the chamber. And then, amidst the chaos, came a new sound, not the shrieks of goblins, nor the clash of steel. It was deeper, more resonant. A sound that did not belong to the living. A sound that had not been heard in Middle-earth for 1,000 years. Doom, doom. The drums pounded again, stronger now, shaking the very walls. The orcs faltered, their attack wavering. Even the great troll hesitated, shifting uneasily, as if sensing something far worse than itself. And then the flames came, far beyond the battle, deep within the corridors of Khazad-dûm. A glow began to rise. It was not the flicker of torchlight, nor the red gleam of goblin eyes. It was something greater, something far more terrible. Fire blooming in the dark. A shadow, vast and unfathomable, stirred from its place of rest. It moved with slow, deliberate power, its presence filling the air like a coming storm. The orcs screamed and fled, their fear greater than their bloodlust. Even the troll, a creature of brutish strength, bellowed in terror and stumbled back into the shadows. Gandalf turned sharply, his voice urgent. To the bridge. The Fellowship did not hesitate. They ran, their feet pounding against stone, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the hall was consumed by firelight. And then, as they reached the edge of the abyss, they saw it. A form wreathed in flame, its eyes burning like coals in the darkness. It moved with a terrible grace, its vast wings unfurling like the shadow of death itself. A Balrog of Morgoth, Durin's Bane. For a long moment, it stood there watching them, measuring them. Then it stepped forward, its great whip of fire unfurling with a crack that split the air like a thunderclap. The Fellowship had faced many dangers, but none like this, none like the creature that had burned an empire to the ground, none like the terror that had slumbered beneath the mountain. Durin's Bane had awakened, And now there was nowhere left to run. The fire loomed before them, living, breathing, shifting like a thing untethered from time. The Balrog's silhouette burned against the darkness, its form half shadow, half flame. It did not rush forward in reckless fury, nor did it strike without thought. It simply moved with the slow, deliberate inevitability of doom itself. Gandalf stood at the front of the fellowship, his staff raised, his face etched with the weight of knowledge and fate. "Run," he commanded, his voice steady despite the storm of fire before them. "This is beyond any of you." The others hesitated, but only for a moment. Aragorn and Boromir seized Frodo and the hobbits, urging them forward. Legolas did not take his eyes off the demon as he followed, his elven senses screaming warnings in every fiber of his being. Gimli lingered only long enough to glance back at the terror that had claimed his ancestors' halls, before gritting his teeth and fleeing with the others. The Balrog did not pursue. Not yet. It did not need to. It had all the time in the world. The fellowship ran, feet striking the stone in frantic rhythm. Down crumbling staircases, through vast chambers lined with empty thrones, across bridges that had long since begun to crack beneath the weight of years. The halls of Khazad-dûm stretched endlessly before them, a labyrinth of forgotten splendor and silent ruin. Behind them, the Balrog followed. It did not run. It did not need to. Each step it took shook the very bones of the mountain, flames licking at the walls as its presence devoured the air itself. It was not merely a creature of fire, it was fire. It was shadow incarnate, a remnant of an age when the world was young and ruled by gods and monsters, and it was waking from a sleep far too long. Doom, doom. The drums still pounded in the distance, echoing through the hollow kingdom. But the orcs had fled, their fear of the Balrog greater than their hatred of the intruders. They knew this terror. They knew what it could do, and they would not stand in its way. Faster, Aragorn urged, dragging Frodo forward. Gimli's breath was heavy, his dwarven endurance tested to its limit. He clenched his axe, but knew it would do no good against what lurked behind them. Legolas, light-footed and swift, glanced over his shoulder, his sharp elven eyes catching glimpses of flame licking at the edges of the corridor. The Balrog was closer. Then, at last, they saw it, the bridge of Khazad-dûm. It stretched before them, a narrow span of stone suspended over a chasm so deep that no light reached its bottom. It was ancient, crumbling at the edges, worn by centuries of abandonment. Beyond it, the path led to the great eastern doors of Moria to escape. But to cross, the bridge meant facing what followed them. Gandalf turned, raising his hand. "Go," he commanded. "I will deal with the Balrog." "No," Aragorn took a step forward. "You cannot face this alone." But the wizard's eyes were firm, resolved. "This is not your battle," he said softly. "It is mine." Aragorn hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he turned and ran, leading the others across the bridge. And as the fellowship reached the other side, the Balrog stepped into the chamber. It moved slowly, deliberately, its great horns casting shadows against the fire that swirled around its form. Its wings unfurled, stretching wide, not of flesh, but of darkness, an extension of the void from which it had been born. It lifted its whip, the fire coiling like a serpent in its grip. Gandalf did not flinch. He stood in the center of the bridge, his staff planted firmly upon the stone. His gray robes billowed in the heated wind, his face stern, unyielding. He had faced many things in his long years. He had seen the rise and fall of kings, the clash of armies, the slow decay of time. But now, in this moment, he faced an echo of the past, one of Morgoth's oldest and deadliest creations. The Balrog growled, a deep, thunderous sound that rumbled through the chamber. It took a step forward, fire crackling with each movement. Gandalf raised his staff. "You cannot pass." His voice rang out, cutting through the roar of the flames. It was not a plea nor a warning. It was a command. The Balrog paused, as if weighing the words. Then it stepped forward. Gandalf struck his staff upon the bridge, his other hand lifting his sword, Glamdring. "I am the servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun." His voice carried through the hollow halls, ringing against the stone. The Balrog roared, its whip lashing out. Gandalf raised his staff, blocking the strike, the force of the impact sending sparks flying. The wizard staggered, but did not fall. "You shall not pass." With those words, he slammed his staff upon the bridge. A crack ran through the stone. The Balrog took another step, its massive foot landing just as the bridge gave way beneath it. The demon fell. Fire and shadow plunged into the abyss, its whip snapping wildly as it tumbled into the darkness. Its roar echoed, growing fainter as it vanished into the void below. Silence. The fellowship stood frozen on the far side of the chasm, breathless, watching. Gandalf remained where he was, shoulders heaving, exhaustion weighing upon him. Then, without warning, the whip lashed out from the darkness, wrapping around his ankle. The wizard's eyes widened. "No," Frodo cried, rushing forward. But Aragorn caught him, holding him back. Gandalf teetered on the edge. He clung to the stone, fingers gripping desperately. But the Balrog's pull was too strong. The fire burned beneath him, a void of light and death. For a fleeting moment, he looked at them, not with fear nor regret, but with a quiet acceptance. Then, with a final breath, he whispered, "Fly, you fools." And he let go. He vanished into the darkness. The fellowship stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment crushing down upon them. Gimli let out a choked sound, his fists clenched. Boromir's face was pale, his usual bravado stripped away. Frodo fell to his knees, eyes brimming with unshed tears. Aragorn turned sharply. "We cannot stay, we must go." His voice was strained but steady. He grabbed Frodo by the arm, pulling him up. "Come." Legolas hesitated, his keen eyes searching the abyss, as if hopping for some sign, some impossible miracle. But there was nothing. Only darkness. Only silence. The Fellowship fled, their grief swallowed by the shadows of Moria. And behind them, beneath the mountain, in the depths of the chasm, where no light reached, something stirred. The battle was not over. Not yet. The Fellowship ran, grief pressing against their chests like a heavy stone, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The halls of Moria stretched endlessly before them, but they no longer felt like an ancient kingdom. Now, they were nothing more than a tomb, a vast, empty graveyard that had claimed too many souls. And among those lost to its darkness was Gandalf. Frodo's feet stumbled on the uneven stone, but Aragorn's firm grip kept him upright. His vision blurred with tears, his heart hammering. He could still hear the echo of Gandalf's voice, *fly, you fools, *, before the wizard had fallen into the abyss, before the Balrog had dragged him into the void. Sam was at his side, his face pale but determined. Merry and Pippin, usually full of laughter, were silent now, their expressions shadowed with sorrow. Gimli's breath was heavy, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Legolas ran with effortless grace, but his normally keen eyes were clouded. Even Boromir, ever the warrior, seemed shaken. None of them had expected this. None of them had believed, even for a moment, that Gandalf could fall. But he had, and now they were alone. The drums had stopped. The echoes of the Balrog's roar had faded into silence. The halls of Moria, once so full of noise and chaos, were now eerily quiet, as if the very mountain itself had fallen into mourning. Ahead, a faint light glimmered in the distance, the eastern doors, the exit. Aragorn's voice was steady but firm. "We are nearly there. Do not falter now." But his own heart was heavy. He had known Gandalf longer than any of them. He had fought beside him, traveled with him, trusted in his wisdom. And now he was gone. He did not allow himself the luxury of stopping. They had to move. They had to reach the open air. The tunnel sloped upward, and with one final burst of effort, they ran through the archway and out into the world beyond. The light of day struck them like a physical force. The crisp mountain air filled their lungs, cold and sharp, yet freeing. After so long in the oppressive darkness of Moria, it was almost overwhelming. They had escaped, but the weight of their loss was not so easily left behind. Frodo staggered to a halt, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He turned back, staring into the dark threshold of the great doors, his heart aching. He half expected to see Gandalf emerge, brushing dust from his robes, muttering about foolishness and haste. But the doorway remained empty. He was gone. Pippin collapsed onto a rock, his small frame trembling. Merry sat beside him, his arm draped over his cousin's shoulders. Sam stood beside Frodo, his face tight with barely restrained grief. Gimli turned toward the great halls one final time, his gaze filled with sorrow and anger. He had lost more than a friend. He had lost a connection to his ancestors, to the home he had never known, but had always dreamed of reclaiming. Moria, the great kingdom of his people, had given him nothing but death. Boromir exhaled slowly, looking to Aragorn. What now? His voice was quieter than usual, lacking its usual confidence. Aragorn's jaw tightened. He turned to Frodo, who still stared at the doors, lost in thought. The burden on the hobbit's shoulders had only grown heavier. After a moment, Aragorn straightened. "We move on." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of necessity. Frodo finally looked up at him. There were no tears on his face, only a quiet, distant understanding. A silent nod. The others followed. They left Moria behind, the mountain rising like a grave marker at their backs. But far beneath the stone, beyond the reach of daylight, the battle was not over. Gandalf fell. The darkness swallowed him. The cold wind of the abyss howling past his ears. The Balrog tumbled beside him, its form shifting between flame and shadow, its molten eyes locked onto his. Down, down, down they fell, deeper than any mortal had ever dared to go. The mountain above became a distant memory, the world of the living fading into nothing. Gandalf's robes whipped around him, his staff still clutched in his grip. He did not panic. He did not struggle. He knew this was not the end. The Balrog's great wings unfurled, though they did not slow its descent. They were not wings of flight, but of shadow, shrouding it in a darkness deeper than night itself. And then, at last, they struck the water. The force of impact sent waves surging outward, steam rising in great clouds as fire met ice-cold depths. The ancient underground lake churned violently, the weight of their collision sending echoes through the vast cavern. Gandalf's body was driven deep beneath the surface, but he did not allow the darkness to claim him. His staff pulsed with light, his will unshaken. With a great burst of power, he surged upward, breaking free of the water's grasp. The Balrog rose as well, its fire momentarily dimmed, but its fury undiminished. It came at him, whip lashing, flames sparking against the stone walls of the cavern. Gandalf met the strike with his own, Glamdring flashing in the darkness, striking against the demon's molten flesh. Sparks flew as the sword clashed with the Balrog's fire-wreathed blade. The battle had truly begun. They fought in the depths, in the forgotten tunnels beneath the world, where no sun had ever shone. Gandalf's light burned against the blackness, his every strike laced with the power of the valor. The Balrog countered with brute strength, with fire that seared the very air. Time became meaningless. They fought across bridges of stone, through caverns lost to history. They battled upon upon ledges that crumbled beneath their feet, neither willing to yield, neither able to fall. And then, at last, they began to climb. The endless stair, a structure spoken of only in legend, a spiraling ascent that wound its way from the deepest pits of Moria to the highest peak of the mountain. It had been lost for centuries, buried beneath rock and time. But now, it was their battlefield. Step by step, they ascended. The Balrog climbed with slow, menacing certainty, its massive form pressing ever upward. Gandalf pursued, never relenting, never allowing the darkness to claim victory. They rose higher and higher, until at last they emerged into the open air. The world was waiting. At the summit of Sigil, the sky churned with storm clouds, lightning crackling across the heavens. The wind howled around them. The mountaintop, an ancient, sacred place, untouched by the passage of time. Here, the final blow would be struck. The Balrog roared, its fire burning anew, its full might unleashed beneath the wrath of the storm. It raised its sword of flame, preparing to end the battle once and for all. Gandalf stood firm, his staff in one hand, Glamdring in the other. His eyes burned with a fire that was not of this world. He was no longer just the wandering wizard, no longer merely the gray pilgrim. He was something more, and with a voice that rang through the heavens, he declared his final stand. The storm raged, the mountain trembled, and the fire and shadow of Durin's Bane met its end. Lightning split the heavens as Gandalf and the Balrog clashed atop the peak of Sigil, high above the world. The storm raged around them, wind howling like the cries of ancient spirits. The sky, a swirling tempest of shadow and light. The final battle had begun. The Balrog rose to its full height, a monstrous form of fire and darkness, its molten eyes burning with an eternal hatred. It had been a lord of terror in ages past, a creature of destruction born from the forges of Morgoth himself. It had lain hidden for millennia beneath the misty mountains, biding its time, until the greed of dwarves had woken it from its slumber. Now here it stood, in the open air for the first time in an age, its great whip of fire curling in the storm, its sword a blade of pure flame. Gandalf did not waver. The wizard stood firm, rain and wind lashing against him, his robes tattered and scorched from the long battle that had led them here. His staff, though worn, still crackled with power, and Glamdring, the foehammer, gleamed with a silver light, untouched by time or flame. They circled one another, predator and prey, though which was which could no longer be said. The Balrog struck first. Its great sword came down in an arc of searing fire, the force of the blow enough to cleave stone asunder. Gandalf raised his staff and met the strike, the impact shaking the mountaintop, sending tremors through the very bones of the earth. Sparks flew, and the flames hissed as the rain sought to quench them. The Balrog swung again, its whip lashing through the air, but Gandalf moved with the swiftness of a younger man, stepping aside as the fiery tendrils cracked the stone where he had stood but moments before. With a cry, he struck back. Glamdring cut through the storm, its blade meeting the Balrog's molten flesh. A howl of rage erupted from the beast, fire spilling from the wound, but it did not falter. The battle raged on. They fought across the summit, their clash a dance of fire and light, of shadow and storm. The elements themselves seemed to take sides, the rain falling harder, the wind howling louder, as if the world longed to see this ancient evil undone. The Balrog bellowed, spreading its great wings of shadow, the storm feeding its fury. It reared back, drawing power from the depths of the abyss, its flames burning hotter, brighter. Gandalf knew what was coming. With a great roar, the Balrog unleashed its full wrath. Fire exploded from its form, the air itself igniting in a blinding inferno. The heat was unbearable, even in the freezing heights. The mountain trembled under its fury. For a moment, the wizard was lost in the fire, his silhouette barely visible within the swirling blaze. Then, through the inferno, his voice rang out like a thunderclap. "You have no power here." The storm answered him. A bolt of lightning, bright as the sun, split the sky and struck the peak of Sigil. The light of the heavens itself coursed through the stone, through the wind, through Gandalf. He raised his staff, and power surged through him, radiating outward in a brilliant white blaze. The Balrog roared in defiance, but it was too late. Gandalf brought Glamdring down in a single, mighty stroke. The blade cut through the darkness, cleaving the Balrog's fiery form. A deafening crack echoed through the mountains as the demon staggered, its fire flickering, its strength faltering. It tried to strike back, but its limbs had grown heavy, its flames guttering like a candle in the wind. Gandalf stepped forward, his staff burning with the light of the valor. With one final word, he cast the demon down. The Balrog fell. Its body, once so mighty, crumbled as it tumbled from the peak, its fire fatting, its shadow stretching long as it descended into the abyss below. And then, at last, the flames went out. Durin's Bane, the terror of Moria, the last of Morgoth's great demons, was no more. The storm began to quiet. The rain, which had once lashed the mountain with fury, softened to a gentle mist. The wind, which had howled with rage, now whispered through the crags like a sigh of relief. But Gandalf stood unmoving. His form, once strong, now trembled. His staff, cracked from the force of his power, crumbled to dust in his grasp. His body, long pushed beyond its limits, could endure no longer. He staggered, his breath, heavy with exhaustion, misted in the cold air. He had won, but at what cost? The light of the morning sun began to break through the clouds, bathing the mountaintop in golden light. The storm had passed. Gandalf, weary beyond measure, closed his eyes, and he fell. His body slumped to the stone, his breath leaving him in a final exhale. Silence. For a long moment, the world stood still. Then, as the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, something stirred. A presence unseen but undeniable. A warmth, gentle and ancient, like the first light of creation itself. Gandalf's form shimmered. The gray of his robes, the lines of weariness upon his face, the burden of long years, all of it began to fade. And from the quiet, a new light emerged. He was not gone. Not yet. Somewhere beyond the reach of time and space, he was being called. Not by death, nor by darkness, but by something greater. His journey was not yet over. His purpose was not yet fulfilled. And so, in the hush of the mountaintop, in the place where fire and shadow had met their end, something new was beginning. Gandalf the Grey had fallen, but Gandalf the White was about to rise. The wind whispered over the summit of Sigil, carrying the scent of stone and storm, of ancient battles fought and won. The mountain, once shrouded in fire and shadow, stood silent now, its peak cleansed by the light of dawn. But in the quiet, in the stillness after the storm, something stirred. Gandalf lay upon the cold rock, his form motionless, his breath stilled. The marks of battle were upon him, his robes torn, his staff shattered, his body drained of all strength. He had struck down Durin's Bane, the terror that had haunted the halls of Khazad-dûm for an age. But in doing so, he had spent the last of himself. Darkness should have claimed him. The long sleep of death should have taken hold. And yet, something lingered, an ember that refused to fade, a spark that would not be snuffed out. Far beyond the world of flesh and stone, Gandalf drifted. There was no sky here, no earth beneath his feet, no walls to enclose him. There was only light, vast and endless, neither warm nor cold, neither bright nor dim. It was not the light of the sun nor the stars, but something older, something eternal. He felt himself floating, weightless as a leaf upon a quiet stream. There was no pain here, no burden of time, no sorrow of loss. The memories of his long journey, his battles, his triumphs, his failures seemed distant now, like echoes across a vast chasm. Then a voice. It was not a voice in the way mortals understood it. It did not speak in words, nor in song, nor in whispers upon the wind. And yet, Gandalf knew it. He had always known it. The voice of the One. It was calling him back. He did not resist. For the first time in many long years, he let go. He surrendered himself to the light, to the will that had guided him since the beginning. And as he did, something changed. The light around him shifted, coalescing, shaping itself into something new. He felt warmth return to him, a presence filling him with renewed strength. The weight of his old self, of his doubts, his weariness, his fears fell away like dust in the wind. And then there was fire, not the consuming fire of the Balrog, nor the cruel flame of destruction. This was a different fire, pure, radiant, the flame of Anor, the sacred light of the valor. It did not burn him. It remade him. A new strength surged through him, filling his limbs, straightening his back. The old robes of Gandalf, the gray dissolved into nothingness, replaced by something greater, white, brighter than the first snowfall upon the peaks of Caradhras, purer than the silver moon upon the waters of Lorien. The color of rebirth, of wisdom unclouded, of power renewed. He was not as he had been. He was not merely an old man with a staff and a burden to bear. He had been sent back, not as the gray pilgrim, not as the weary traveler. He had returned as Asterisk Gandalf, the white asterisk. His eyes opened. The sky stretched above him, vast and endless, the clouds drifting like pale ships upon a sapphire sea. He could feel the cool stone beneath him, the wind against his skin. The world was waiting. He sat up slowly, feeling the strength in his limbs, the power that coursed through him like the rivers of time itself. He was new, yet he was the same. The memories of Gandalf the Grey remained within him, but now they were clearer, sharper. He understood things he had not before. The darkness had lost its hold on him. He was no longer a wanderer in shadow. He was the light that would stand against it. He rose to his feet, his new robes billowing in the mountain wind. He had no staff, not yet, but he did not need one. He had become a force beyond what he once was. His time in death had been brief, but time was a strange thing for beings such as him. The valor had sent him back for a purpose, and that purpose was now clearer than ever. The war was far from over. Sauron was rising, his reach spreading across Middle-earth like a plague. The Fellowship was broken, scattered. Frodo and Sam were alone, venturing into the very heart of darkness, and they did not yet know what awaited them. They would need him. They all would. His gaze turned south, toward the lands beyond the mountains. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the strands of fate weaving themselves into a pattern, yet unseen. His task was not finished, and so, with the first light of dawn gleaming upon him, Gandalf the White stepped forward, leaving the peak of Sigil behind. He walked without hesitation, his path already set before him. Rohan awaited, and so did war. Gandalf moved with purpose, his robes billowing in the high winds of the mountain pass. The climb down from Sigil was not an easy one, but his steps were sure, steady. He was no longer bound by the frailty of his former self. Every movement carried the grace of one who had touched the very fabric of time and returned unbroken. His body was new, unwearied by age, yet he carried all the wisdom of his past self, sharpened by the trial of death and rebirth. His thoughts were not of himself, but of the world below. The Fellowship was in peril. The war was unfolding even now, and he had no time to linger in reflection. He had been sent back for a reason. As he descended, the misty mountains stretched endlessly before him, their jagged peaks piercing the sky like the spines of some ancient beast. Far below, beyond the slopes, lay the rolling plains of Rohan, a land of golden fields and strong-willed people. He could feel their plight even from here. Darkness crept ever closer to their borders, slithering like a viper in the shadows, waiting to strike. The enemy moved swiftly, and he needed to be swifter still. His feet carried him beyond the ice and rock, down through hidden trails long forgotten by men and elves alike. The cold of the mountain began to fade as he entered the lower valleys, where green grass whispered beneath the wind. He had no need for rest, no need for food or drink. He was driven by something greater than mortal weariness. The sun arched high in the sky, yet he did not slow. Each step brought him closer to the world of men, closer to those who needed him most. Then, as he neared the fringes of the mountains, he felt a presence, something watching, waiting. He did not reach for a weapon, for he had none. But he did not need one. His power was greater than steel, greater than arrows or blades. He lifted his head, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. A shadow moved in the trees. Then, from the cover of the wood, a white shape emerged. A great horse, taller and more majestic than any steed of men. Its coat shone like silver in the sunlight, its mane flowing like a river of silk. Its eyes were deep, filled with a wisdom that surpassed that of any common beast. It did not shy away from him, did not rear or flee. It stood, waiting, as if it had known he would come. Shadowfax, the lord of all horses, Gandalf approached, his movements slow, reverent. Shadowfax did not belong to any man nor any king. He was his own master, free as the wind, untamed and unbroken. And yet, as Gandalf neared, the great steed lowered his head in understanding. They knew each other, bound by something deeper than mere words. Without a sound, Gandalf reached out, his hand resting against Shadowfax's strong neck. The horse did not resist. "We have far to go, my friend," Gandalf murmured, his voice low, steady. "The time of waiting is over." Shadowfax tossed his head, his great muscles tensing beneath his gleaming coat. Without hesitation, Gandalf swung himself onto the steed's back, settling into place as if he had always belonged there. Then, with a powerful leap, Shadowfax surged forward, his hooves barely touching the earth as he ran. He was faster than any horse in Middle-earth, faster than the wind itself. The world blurred around them as they raced across the open land, past hills and rivers, past forests and fields. The mountains of Moria vanished behind them, left to their silence, their secrets. The land of Rohan lay ahead, and beyond it, the shadow of war. As they rode, Gandalf's thoughts turned to the days to come. Saruman, once a brother, had turned against them, his mind poisoned by Sauron's whispers. The White Wizard had fallen, betraying his own order, seeking power instead of wisdom. And in doing so, he had turned his gaze upon Rohan, twisting the will of its king, sowing discord among its people. Theoden, king of the Mark, sat upon his throne, but he was no longer the ruler he had once been. Saruman's words had clouded his mind, his strength drained, his wisdom stolen. A puppet trapped in his own hall, while the enemy gathered at his doorstep. The people of Rohan did not know it yet, but their time was running short. War would come for them, and if they were not ready, they would fall. But Gandalf would not allow that to happen. He had seen too much, lost too much. He had walked through death itself and returned, not to watch the world crumble, but to stand against the coming storm. The tide of darkness would rise, but he would be the light against it. Shadowfax carried him ever forward, swift as an arrow, tireless as the stars. The golden fields of Rohan stretched before them, the wind singing in his ears. The world was changing. The final battle was drawing near. But for now, there was still time. Time to set things right. Time to remind the world that all hope was not lost. Gandalf the White had returned, and Middle-earth would know it. The wind roared past as Shadowfax carried Gandalf across the great plains of Rohan, faster than the eye could follow. The sky above was a canvas of shifting clouds, the golden fields stretching endlessly beneath them. The land was beautiful, untouched by war for now. But Gandalf could feel it, the unseen hand of darkness creeping ever closer. Rohan was no longer safe. It was crumbling from within, its people unaware of how close they stood to ruin. Saruman had done his work well. The White Wizard, once the leader of Gandalf's own order, had turned his wisdom to wickedness, his mind clouded by greed, his loyalty sold to Sauron's whispers. He had poisoned the mind of Theoden, the king of Rohan, twisting his thoughts with deceit, draining his strength with false counsel. And while the king withered under the weight of lies, Saruman's armies gathered in the shadows. Gandalf knew that time was against them. The walls of Rohan would not hold forever. The men of the Mark were brave, but they did not yet see the full extent of the storm that was about to break upon them. If they did not wake soon, they would wake only to fire and blood. Shadowfax ran without rest, his hooves barely touching the earth. The miles vanished behind them, the rolling hills and winding rivers of Rohan passing in a blur. Gandalf did not look back. Moria was behind him, its dark secrets buried once more. His battle with Durin's Bane was finished, but the war ahead would be greater still. At last, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Edoras came into view. The golden hall of Meduseld sat atop a lonely hill, its high roof gleaming even in the dimming light. The banners of the Mark fluttered weakly in the wind, though their strength seemed faded, as if they too had been touched by the weariness that plagued their king. Gandalf pulled Shadowfax to a halt at the foot of the hill. He could see the guards at the gate watching him, their eyes cautious, their hands resting on their swords. He did not blame them. Rohan had been left vulnerable for too long. They had reason to fear strangers, but he was no stranger. Slowly he dismounted, his white robes billowing as he stepped forward. The guards tensed, exchanging wary glances. One of them, a man with a scarred cheek, and weary eyes, raised his spear. "Halt," he said firmly. "Who comes to the Golden Hall?" Gandalf did not stop. His gaze met the guard's, steady and unwavering. "You know me," he said simply. The guard hesitated, his brow furrowing. There was something about this man, something familiar. But this was not the Gandalf he had once seen. The last time the Grey Pilgrim had come to Rohan, he had been a traveler, a wanderer with tattered robes and a weathered face. But now he stood before them like something out of legend. His presence like a storm contained in human form. His white robes shining even in the growing twilight. The guard lowered his spear, stepping back. "Mithrandir," he breathed. Gandalf nodded. "I must speak with Theoden." The other guards still hesitated. One of them, younger and uncertain, shook his head. "The king is unwell," he said carefully. "He does not see many visitors." "That is why I must see him," Gandalf replied. "I have come to set things right." Before the guards could answer, another voice rang out from behind the gate. "If you seek the king, you will find him in no state to listen." The man who stepped forward was lean and sharp-eyed, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in dark robes, his hair slicked back like a raven's feathers. There was a false smile on his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. Wormtongue. Gandalf felt the weight of Saruman's poison in the man's very presence. Grima Wormtongue was not a warrior, not a sorcerer, but his weapon was far more insidious. He was a whisperer, a twister of truths, a leech that clung to power and bled it dry. "You are not welcome here, old man," Wormtongue continued, his tone oily, dismissive. "The king does not need the ramblings of a weathered wanderer." Gandalf met his gaze and held it. "You mistake me for someone else." His voice was quiet, yet it carried a weight that made the air seem heavier. "I am not the man you once knew." Wormtongue hesitated for the briefest of moments. Something flickering in his eyes. Was it fear? No, he would not admit to fear. He sneered, recovering himself. "It makes no difference. Theoden will not see you." Gandalf took a step forward. "He will." Wormtongue opened his mouth to protest. But then something changed. The air shifted. It was as if a shadow had passed over the sun, though no clouds marked the sky. A force unseen, yet undeniable, pressed upon the space between them. Wormtongue stumbled back. He swallowed, his bravado faltering. The guards, who had stood uncertainly before, now straightened. They did not speak, but something in their posture had changed. For the first time in a long time, doubt crept into their faces. Gandalf turned to them. "Your king is not himself. You have seen it, have you not?" His voice was not pleading nor demanding. It was simply true asterisk. He was once strong, once wise, but now he lingers in shadow, and you do not know why. The guards exchanged glances. The truth of it was undeniable. Theoden had grown weaker, more distant. They had been told it was merely age, but they had begun to doubt. And now, before them, stood a figure of undeniable power, a man returned from death itself. One of them stepped aside, then another. The way to Meduseld was open. Wormtongue's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. He could do nothing. Gandalf stepped past him, Shadowfax following at his side. The doors to the Golden Hall loomed before him, heavy with the weight of what lay beyond. He would face Saruman's poison. He would break the chains that bound the king. For Gandalf, the White had come to Rohan, and no shadow would stand against him. The great doors of Meduseld groaned as they swung open, the golden light of the hall spilling onto the stone steps where Gandalf stood. A hush settled over the guards as he stepped forward, Shadowfax lingering just outside, as if sensing that this was a battle of words and will rather than steel. The air within the Golden Hall was thick, heavy with something unseen, a weight that pressed down upon those who entered. The warmth of the great hearth could not dispel the feeling of suffocation. The unseen chains that bound this place, and there, seated upon the high throne of Rohan, was Theoden, king of the Mark. But he was not the warrior king that legends spoke of, not the proud horse lord who had once led his riders across the plains with fire in his heart. The man who sat upon the throne was withered, his skin pale, his shoulders slumped as though he carried a burden too great to bear. His once bright eyes were clouded, dull, unfocused. The golden crown upon his head looked heavy, too heavy for a man who no longer ruled his own will. At his side, like a vulture perched upon a dying beast, stood Grima Wormtongue. The advisor leaned in close to the king, his voice soft and sickly sweet. "You have a guest, my lord," he murmured, though the words were not spoken with welcome. His dark eyes flickered toward Gandalf, narrowing slightly. Mithrandir, returned from the grave, they say. How fortunate we are to receive such a visit. Gandalf did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on Theoden. "My lord Theoden," he said, his voice steady, but not unkind. "I come to you as a friend." The king did not move, did not acknowledge him. Wormtongue smirked. "The king is weary, I fear. The burdens of rule weigh heavily upon him in these difficult times." He tilted his head slightly, his voice dripping with feigned sorrow. "Perhaps you should not trouble him." Gandalf took another step forward. "I do not trouble him," he said. "You do." For the first time, Wormtongue flinched. A flicker of something passed across his face, anger, perhaps, or fear, quickly masked behind his usual sneer. "You speak of things you do not understand, old man," he hissed. "The king is ill, his body aged by time. It is not my whispers that have done this, but the cruel hands of fate." Gandalf's eyes flashed. "Enough of your poison." His staff, long concealed beneath his cloak, struck the ground. A sound like distant thunder rumbled through the hall, a pulse of power rippling through the very air. The torches flickered, the flames dancing as if startled by the sudden shift. Theoden stirred. A slow breath rattled from his chest, his fingers twitching against the arm of his throne. Wormtongue's confidence faltered. "You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey." Gandalf took another step, his presence filling the hall, not with fear, but with something far greater. "I am not Gandalf the Grey." The hall trembled. The weight in the air, the unseen chains that had held Theoden in their grasp, wavered. "I am Gandalf the White," he declared, "and I come to you in your darkest hour." His voice rang like a bell, and suddenly the very air seemed to break. A wind that was not of this world swept through Meduseld, carrying with it the scent of open fields, of clean rain, of the sky before a great storm. Theoden gasped. His body shuddered as if waking from a long and terrible dream. His hands gripped the arms of his throne. His breath ragged. Wormtongue stumbled backward, his face pale. "No, no, this is not possible." Gandalf raised his staff. Light, pure, radiant, blinding, burst forth. It did not burn like fire, did not consume like the Balrog's flames, but it cut through the shadows like the dawn, piercing the remnants of night. The spell was broken. Theoden's form straightened, his fingers tightening into fists. His face, once lined with unnatural weariness, seemed to regain its strength. The clouded haze in his eyes lifted, revealing the sharp, piercing gaze of a man who had once been a king, and was a king once more. For the first time in a long time, Theoden, son of Thengel, saw asterisk. He blinked, as if waking from a long, dark slumber. He looked upon Gandalf, upon the assembled guards, upon Wormtongue, who now trembled like a rat caught in the open. What is this?" Theoden murmured, his voice hoarse but growing stronger. His fingers flexed, as though testing their strength. He turned his gaze to Gandalf, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You are free, my lord," Gandalf said. Silence filled the hall. Then Theoden stood, slowly, shakily at first, but then with growing confidence. The weight upon his shoulders was gone, the chains that had bound him shattered. He looked upon the hall with new eyes, and for the first time in years, he remembered who he was. His gaze settled upon Wormtongue. The advisor took a step back, then another, sweat beading upon his brow. My lord," he stammered, "you are not well. You must rest." Silence, the single word, spoken in a voice once more filled with the strength of kings, echoed through Meduseld like a hammer striking stone. Wormtongue paled. He looked around as if searching for escape, but there was none. The guards, once under his influence, now stood tall and resolute. They saw their king restored, and they would obey him. Theoden took a step forward, his gaze hard. "You have lied to me, whispered poison in my ear while my people suffered." His hands curled into fists. "You have stolen my mind, my will, my very strength." Wormtongue fell to his knees. "Mercy, my lord. I only did what I thought was best for Rohan." Gandalf watched in silence. This was Theoden's judgment to make. The king stared at the man who had betrayed him. Then slowly, his lips curled in disgust. Get him out of my sight. The guards seized Wormtongue, dragging him away despite his protests, his pleas. The doors of Meduseld slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. A deep breath left Theoden's chest. He turned to Gandalf. How long has it been? Gandalf's gaze was gentle. Too long, my friend. The king's hands trembled, but this time it was not from weakness, it was from the weight of realization. My people, he whispered. What have I done? You still have time, Gandalf said. But you must act. Saruman's armies march even now. War is upon you. Theoden straightened. He turned to his guards, to his people, his voice ringing with the authority of a king reborn. Then we shall ride to war. A great cry rang out in Meduseld, a cry of renewal, of defiance. The halls of Rohan would no longer be silent. The riders of the Mark would rise once more, and as Gandalf watched, a small smile touched his lips. The war was not yet won, but hope had returned, and sometimes hope was all that was needed to change the course of history. The end